Hello and welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deep into our work here on our farm at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. Today, we're going to do our quarterly review, looking at the first quarter of 2022 and the work on our farm. And with us are winemaker Nate Wall, Director of Agriculture Garrett Long, and Director of Sales Nate Winters. So I'm going to ask Garrett to lead us off and talk about what happened on the farm.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. I think, I wanted to start at a place that is really important and near and dear to my heart because we wouldn't be able to do any of the farming, winemaking, enjoying of the wine without our people and our staff. Part of our regenerative organic certification is that we are required to to engage with an organization we selected called the Equitable Food Initiative, or EFI. And we're going through the steps to get a team here trained in matters such as conflict resolution, social fairness, farmer and farm worker fairness. And that team, or that collaboration of six staff members, which is made up of both non-management staff as well as managers, are all going through this training and development to be able to certify Troon Vineyard as an EFI certified farm and operation, which is something that we're really excited about to support our staff members with things such as a living wage, of course, for this area, year-round employment with benefits. All of this is part of our benefits package for our company, and we're really excited to more robustly support our team with this training. So that's really exciting. Our hope as we enter into the fall season is that we'll undergo an inspection and an audit by our certifiers for our organic certification, our regenerative organic, and our biodynamic certification. And we're hopeful to achieve the gold level of the regenerative organic certification this fall. We're currently at the silver level, and obtaining this social fairness certification through EFI is basically the limiting factor. So we're really excited about what that will look like. And hopefully you'll see a little gold ROC stamp on our wine next year. So I just wanted to start with our people and acknowledge, the importance of farming and everything else that I'll talk about. It wouldn't be possible without our staff. And then to move from there, I wanted to start kind of chronologically in January. We had, as I have come to learn, I've only been here since last August, a little more than 6 months that I've been the director of agriculture. And I've come to learn that in Oregon and in a lot of the Pacific Northwest, January, we can have a strangely unseasonably warm and dry period. That's actually pretty common. And so we were able to take a little bit of break from the snow and the rain in January, which allowed our fields and our roads to dry out. And we were able to get a lot of work done, tractor work in the orchards and making compost. Every year here, we build about 200 finished tons of compost. That starts with 800 tons of manure, 400 tons of manure, 800 yards, and build just a ton of compost. So January and the good weather really allowed us to keep our compost that we made started last fall going and build a couple more piles that we got rained out last fall. Harvest is such a busy time. And so we don't always get around to it based on the weather. And so January provided this opening for us to get that done. That was pretty exciting. Also in January, we did something that we've never done here at Troon before. We've got a flock of 8 sheep, which have been cruising through the vineyards and being grazed rotationally. We're hitting vineyard and non-vineyard areas. We are really working on replacing a lot of the mowing and the weed whacking and the diesel and the labor and everything that's required to just maintain the grasses and the pastures around here. We're looking to our livestock program to help us maintain those. And in January, we bred our sheep for the first time. So lambs have about a 5-month gestation period. And so any day now, as we approach May, I'm seeing some really big udders forming. This is usually one of the last signs that we see before lambs are born. And really excited about what it'll mean for Troon to start having a bunch of baby lambs hopping around the vineyards. So I'm sure you'll see lots of photos on Instagram, and we'll keep you posted about the development of our livestock program. But we're expecting to hopefully about double the size of our sheep flock today, which will really, or this month, which will really allow us to cover greater acreage with our grazing program, and again, even further reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, on mowing, on labor, and all of that. And we're feeding sheep and making chicken eggs and all of that through the process. So it's a real win-win for our program. One of the other things that we're working on through the sort of the slow season, as it's known, I've kind of come to realize after being in agriculture for about 10 years, there really isn't a slow season. maybe if you're in the frigid north or something like that, there is, but things don't really tend to slow down in my world. But when there's less activity in the vineyards, when there's less going on because of the rain and the weather that I talked about, it does provide opportunities to work on other projects. And so, as I was mentioning, that we keep our vineyard team on full year or all year round, we use the winter time or the slow season to work on other projects. And this year, we dedicated a lot of resources to expanding the amount of wildlife habitat and biodiversity reserves that we have here on the farm by building and installing a whole bunch of bird boxes. One of the issues that we deal with in the vines particularly, but on the whole 100-acre farm, is rodents. It's gophers, it's ground squirrels, it's these animals that want to gnaw at the roots and can sometimes take out whole trees or vines or the beautiful plantings that we work so hard on. And so we really look to nature to help us balance those populations of gophers and voles and ground squirrels. And so we want to support raptors or birds of prey. We've got red-tailed hawks, we've got kestrels, we've got barn owls. We've got a huge diversity of birds that depend on these rodents for their food source. And since we've created an ecosystem and we're using cover crops that they really love to chew on, we want to support these birds of prey as much as we can. And so this winter, we built 12 owl boxes and about 20 bluebird boxes. These Western bluebirds are a kind of songbird that also eat insects. And so they help us maintain any sort of pest populations or anything that we have in the vines or throughout the farm by eating loads of insects and feeding their babies. So we're really excited. We're starting to see more bluebirds arrive, migrate here, and start to take up these nest boxes and inhabit them. And we'll be able to share some data on how we are supporting these populations in the future. But all of it is going to support our, again, part of our requirement for our Demeter or our biodynamic certification. There's a minimum of 10% of our total acreage that needs to be dedicated to biodiversity reserves. This is wildlife habitat, this is pollinator plantings, this is sort of a natural swale area or a seasonal waterway through the farm. We've got a big 2-acre or 2.5-acre pond on site that we get lots of migratory birds, geese, swans, ducks that come and live there. And altogether, our more than 10 acres we've dedicated to essentially conserving and supporting wildlife. And so we continue to, double down on that investment every single year. So that's really exciting. Part of the other thing that we're able to do to further expand the amount of biodiversity reserves that we have here is through plant propagation. So we've installed a couple of these, planted a couple of pollinator gardens, as well as a native plant garden that has more than 90 different species of native plants here. And we're able to utilize, take cuttings as well as save seed from these plantings and use our brand new greenhouse that we just finished to propagate these plants. We can start these plants indoors, and when they get strong enough to transplant outside, we can develop them into additional biodiversity reserves and keep nudging up that 10 acres more and more every year. So it's part of our goal here to not just incorporate wildlife, but to intentionally involve them and provide additional habitat that increases every single year.
We are here in the greenhouse at Troon Vineyard. This is brand new to us. We just finished construction on this about 1 month ago, and we immediately jumped right into planting all of our seeds for our vegetable garden. It's the perfect time of year in the spring to be planting out all of our crops. So we've got both our spring crops like our beets and carrots and peas planted, as well as all of our upcoming summer crops like our zucchini, our winter squash, our tomatoes and chilies. Here in the greenhouse, in addition to planting all of our vegetable starts for our garden, we're also doing a whole bunch of flowers, herbs, and native plants that we will plant basically all over the farm. You saw the wildflower habitat that we're expanding. We're planting out our tasting room garden. We're creating these intentional wildlife habitat and these pollinator habitats throughout the farm. And a lot of what we're focusing on is the use of perennial plants. So we've got things like calendula and borage and a lot of these flowers that are going to come back every single year, as well as spread seed. And so by propagating plants here in the greenhouse, we can create more habitat, we can create more pollinator and wildlife habitat, as well as edible and medicinal herbs. These will be harvestable crops just like the vegetables that we can serve to our community, that we can present to our guests as they come out to visit the farm and come for events like farm-to-table dinners or tours. We're really excited about this opportunity that the greenhouse presents to do plant propagation as well as seed starting.
One of the other things that we worked on early in the year, it's amazing that only February, but in February, we do some of our pruning. It's kind of a late winter, early springtime. We try to, again, work with the weather and work with the rhythms of the season to do our pruning when there's not too much rain or precipitation in the forecast. And so we have here almost 2 acres of apple trees. These are heirloom French cider apples. And we were able to do some pruning on our apple trees, as well as plant a whole bunch of other apple trees. We work with a local consultant who runs an organization called Uncommon Apples. And Deborah was able to come out and take cuttings from our existing 2 acres of apples. And over the last year, she propagated through grafting a whole bunch more baby apple trees for us. And we expanded our orchard by about 30% this year. And we'll do, again, another, what is it, Nate, about another 30 or 40% next year as well. And then our cider apple orchard will be complete. And I think you had some notes on the apples too, didn't you?
Yeah, so as part of that pruning, obviously we want to prune and maintain some of that scion wood, like Garrett was mentioning, so that we can basically graft it onto some rootstock and create more baby trees for us to plant. The other thing that we do though is with the apple trees, we have to start developing, they call it the scaffolding system. So basically it's kind of very intentional pruning to allow, and it's very important in the early years of the growth of that tree, to allow that tree to grow in a certain way that will make it more fruitful for the rest of its life. And with apple trees, what this basically means is trying to train some of those early limbs to spread wide, as close to almost a 90-degree angle off of that central leader trunk as they can. The more there's some hormonal balance issues that go on with the trees, that the closer you are to horizontal, the stronger that signal is that the tree sends to bear fruit. So if we can set up these scaffolding now, get them close to 90 degrees, and then kind of set up a couple feet higher, set up another row of scaffolds, a couple feet higher, another row, then that's that form that tree will kind of maintain for the rest of its life. And it will lead to a lot more apples, a lot more fruit over the life of that tree. So kind of getting that process started, even on these younger 1, 2, 3-year-old trees, is really important. So that's another thing that we do kind of in concert with that dormant pruning, both to remove then the unnecessary limbs, like limbs where we don't want it, where it might interfere with the growth of other limbs on the same tree, as well as use some spreaders and other techniques to try to keep those arms down to close to horizontal, so they're going to be more fruitful later on.
Yeah, and we've been developing our fruit orchards pretty extensively, and this year, 2022, we'll see a pretty good expansion of that. So in addition to the cider apple orchard, which I said is more than 2 acres and keeps growing, we're also installing on about a 2-acre plot that we've reserved for gardening. We're doing both more traditional row crops, like you think of when you just drive down the road and see rows of vegetables and annual crops, but we're also incorporating a pretty large part of that 2 acres into mostly perennial food forest. It's sort of a permaculture style approach to forest gardening, is another concept that this has been called. And so the idea is that we are planting our fruit trees in a row, but we are also, about every 3rd tree, we're planting them in trios. Every 3rd tree is a nitrogen fixing tree. They're usually in the legume family, and we are intentionally trading off some of our productivity, some of the fruit yields that we would get in order to support soil health. So what these unique trees do in the family of legumes, the peas and beans and all of that, there's also trees in the same family with their extensive root system. They form relationships with these bacteria that are able to grab nitrogen out of the air. And the air also exists below ground too, and filling up all of the pore space between all these soil particles. And that air that we breathe is more than 70% nitrogen. These little bacteria have this unique ability to grab that nitrogen out of the air, and using a very energy intensive process, they convert it into this plant available nitrogen and share it with the tree. And because these trees are these bacteria are so effective with the support of energy that they get from the tree at producing extra nitrogen, just literally out of thin air, they can actually share that excess nitrogen with the rest of the food forest. And so the idea is that in addition to some of these fruit trees and these nitrogen fixing trees, we're planting all kinds of other perennial crops in there as well. We've got raspberries and blueberries. We've got all kinds of herbs like echinacea, calendula. We've got, let's see, what else are we incorporating? There's probably a good 50 different species of mostly perennial crops and flowers and herbs. And the idea of forest gardening is that you're sort of mimicking this forest ecosystem, which means you have this overstory. Usually this is a tall nut tree or a really large fruit tree. And then you've got more of an understory, which are our fruit trees, which will be kept to about, 10, 15 feet, so that they're easy to pick and prune and manage and harvest. And then below the fruit tree understory, we've got our shrub layer, like elderberries, I forgot to mention, all of those berries, raspberries, blueberries, etc. Below that, we've got those herbs. And then you can even incorporate both root crops. We could plant out some potatoes, some garlic, some onions. There's a really cool one that's used in a lot of permaculture systems called Egyptian walking onions, and focus on the below ground crop production, as well as vining crops, which will eventually, grow up some of these trees, which will serve as a natural scaffolding. And so the idea of sort of sacrificing or trading off some of this productive area by swapping a fruit tree for this nitrogen fixing tree, the idea is that you can actually support greater food production overall in a much more diverse amount of food production by incorporating all these different layers, the canopy levels, the below ground, the vining crops, etc. So I'm really excited about that. I've spent the last couple of months tracking down these really cool varieties of fruit trees, and we are looking to plant them. We're a little bit behind schedule with it being coming up on late spring here, but we're really excited to put some fruit trees in the ground over literally the next couple of days. And this food forest will continue to evolve and get better and better. we don't actually harvest any fruit from the trees for the first 3 to 5 years. And that will be a time when we will get production out of some of these other crops, like the berries and some of the other annual crops and flowers that are in there. So this whole idea of building a food forest is that you're planning for the future, and you're also creating a more resilient system. If we had a really late spring frost, as we did this year, and our apple trees and our plum trees and our nectarines were all flowering at the time when that frost came, that would kill our flowers and really limit the amount of fruit production that we get that year. And so by diversifying your production in this way, you're able to produce just a huge abundance of crops that will last, even if one sort of ends up, getting killed by frost or has a big pest infestation or whatever it might, or gophers, whatever it might be. So that's super exciting. We'll continue to, give you more developments as this is developed. But all of that food forest design is happening alongside all of our vegetable gardening. I mentioned earlier that we just finished construction on a new greenhouse. It's 25 by 50 feet, and it will really allow us to not just start our vegetable seeds indoors and get our tomatoes out into the ground sooner and get them into the farm stand sooner so we can all enjoy them. But it also will be that spot where we can propagate those native plants and seeds and pollinator plants and continue supporting biodiversity in that way as well. The last thing I'll mention is somewhat in support of the wildlife, as well as in support of you folks, our consumers who like to come out to Troon and enjoy a glass of wine. We've undertaken a pretty big task of replanting the entire tasting room garden, which hasn't been done, I don't know, must be a good 20 years. So as hard as it is to remove plants and to sort of take life away, biodynamic systems, regenerative systems are all about supporting life in so many ways. But we made the hard decision to remove some of these old, tired plants that don't really support wildlife. They don't have a harvestable part of the plant like an herb or a flower that we really care about. And so we are replacing that with, again, huge diversity of perennial flowering plants. These will support pollinators. They'll support these beneficial insects that are so important to our whole system and reduce our amount of inputs, reduce our management and our labor needs, and also just really beautify the whole garden around the tasting room. So as you come out to enjoy a glass of wine in May, and we roll into this second quarter of the production season, you'll be accompanied by a really beautiful cut flower garden, a restored dry stream bed with lots of other grasses, native grasses and flowering plants, and a culinary herb garden to support our chefs and our team here. Our staff are able to harvest these herbs as well as take home vegetables year round, which is another great benefit that we provide for our staff. And we're really excited about what this is going to look like and feel like, and the amount of energy and vibrance and color and excitement that it's going to bring to the tasting room. So I will leave it there and hope, leave it with an invite that you guys will come out and join us in May and come enjoy a glass of wine. I think the last thing, is vineyards, really. I mean, there's kind of a joke around here that I take care of everything between the vines, which is very literally intended. We make the compost. I oversee all the livestock rotations, the cover crops, the vegetables, the orchards. All of that is within this wheelhouse of agriculture. But actually, the vines are as well. But I want to pass it over to our winemaker, Nate Wall, to discuss what's been going on in the vineyards and in the cellar.
All right. Yeah. So I guess I can kind of talk about the year thus far, certainly from the vineyard perspective first, then move into what's happening in the winery. But so, in January, February, early, in the winter months, the vines are very much dormant. If you come out to a vineyard, then all it looks like is, a big collection of sticks coming out of the ground. It's, all of the leaves have dropped, and you're just kind of left with last year's growth. in our part of the world here in the Applegate, our winter temperatures can get pretty cool, below freezing, certainly in January and February. Not horrendously so. Like if we do go below freezing, it still is generally in the 20s. It doesn't get much lower than that. Normally, our daytime temperatures are just even in January, February are often above freezing. We kind of hover above and below the freezing point. We'll get some cold snaps. We'll get some snow in January and February normally. It normally sticks around for a couple days and then disappears. That's generally what life is like. So for us then with those dormant vines, we pretty much hold off on our pruning in January and February. A lot of other vineyards are doing their pruning, but we like to hold off a little bit later until either like late February or even better in March. And delaying that dormant pruning also then has a delaying effect on the bud break, of the resulting bud break of those vines afterwards. And I'm really glad that we did that this year, because this year we did end up having some very cold weather some freezing weather in April, just a couple of weeks ago, that could have severely affected our young buds had they been fully emerged. And that was actually the case in the Willamette Valley. They're estimating up to 50% damage and loss in some of those areas. But I'll get to that in a minute. But for us, that later pruning is really helpful in pushing back the bud break time. When we do start that pruning then in March, we kind of have two different trellis training systems out in the vineyard, and both of those are pruned a little bit differently. And I just kind of wanted to mention to you, like with our vine training, one of the systems we have is called VSP. It's vertical shoot positioned. That's a very common training method, certainly in the Willamette Valley. But in this method, that's more what you maybe think of when you think of a vineyard. It's got, you can kind of see in the pictures here, you've got end posts, you've got wires going across to support the growth of the vines. And so ours is technically a cane pruned vertical shoot positioned, and it's what we use for our white wines, pretty much all of our white wines, as well as our Syrah and our Negrette. So what happens there is during this dormant pruning season, you basically cut off all of last year's growth. So all you're left is the trunk with the head, and then you just save two of last year's canes that then get laid down onto the fruiting wire. And so basically it's like a trunk and two sticks. That's what the vineyard looks like after pruning in the winter. And from those canes comes all the new growth for the year. So that has several advantages. One of which is kind of decreased fungal pressure. The other method of doing that is with cordons, with basically permanent arms that have some spurs. The more that older wood can kind of become a repository for certain fungal issues. And so by laying down those canes, using that new growth each year, you kind of limit some of that. And this is a very typical training system. Like I said, it's called vertical shoot positioned. It is a little more labor intensive because as those shoots start coming out, above the fruiting wire, there's a series of catch wires, of kind of guide wires that you do have to position the shoots so that they kind of grow up two-dimensionally inside this row of vines. It's really good for spray penetrations. You're able to keep the canopy up above the fruiting zone, and so any sprays that you may do has a better possibility of hitting where you want it to. That's a little less important for us as we do significantly fewer sprays, being biodynamic and organic, and the sprays we do, especially the biodynamic sprays, The exact targeting is a little, less important. We're more targeting general areas than we are like very specific parts of the plant, which might be more true for conventional agriculture, where you're trying to have very specific sprays. So that's the vertical sheet positioned vines. And then we also have all of our red grapes, except for the Syrah and the Negrette, are head trained. Head training is also known as a goblet or sometimes bush vine. And that's because ultimately when the vine gets older, it kind of ends up looking like a little bush. But instead of kind of this two-dimensional layer of growth for like in vertical shoot positioning, the goblet or the head trained vines come up, form a head, and then radiating out in 3 dimensions is the we leave 4 to 6, 5 normally kind of arms start radiating out with some spurs on it, where the new growth comes from each year. So in this system, which is actually a more, I guess, ancestral method of doing it, it's much simpler because it doesn't require as much infrastructure. Each vine really just needs a stake to kind of tie that young vine to a stake to help it stabilize until it grows a nice big trunk of its own. But in this vine training system, it's good for kind of naturally limiting the productivity of those head trained vines. They kind of set the amount of fruit they're capable of handling. So there's a little less work on our part often to drop fruit to get the vine ripening the correct amount of fruit for premium quality. It also that 3-dimensional canopy also allows for a better ability for us to get that dappled sunlight like into the fruiting zone. So in terms of you want sun to hit the grapes, the developing grapes. Sunlight is what stimulates the phenolic ripeness of the skins. I mean, the phenolic compounds, the tannins, the grippiness, the texture in red wines forms in large part as a response to sun exposure. Think of it as like sunscreen on the grapes. So in that training method, we do get a nicer amount of light. The right amount of light that gets through there. So that's the sort of training, the sort of pruning decisions that we're doing in March. Both of those require a very different mindset. And especially with our younger vines, what we're doing right now is we're actually having to train that initial head. So in the first couple of years of growth, kind of similar to what I was talking about with the apple trees, in the first couple of years of growth of a head trained vine, you kind of need to help it develop that structure that it's going to maintain for the rest of its life, which can be quite long. Another advantage of those head trained vines is they generally have more longevity to them. So that's something where we're definitely planning for future generations by growing vines in this way. It also adds a little more resiliency. They're generally more drought tolerant. Which, as climate changes and our rainfall patterns alter, more resiliency is always a good thing. So that's kind of what we were doing in the vineyard. Not much January, February, pruning in March, and here it is April. And in April is when we start seeing bud break. So we have almost 20 different varieties planted here in 4 different soil types. And each kind of combination and a couple different rootstocks. So each combination of soil and vine type and rootstock leads to a different bud break time for each of these combinations. So some of the earliest varieties to bud break had just started to bud swell and had just started pushing out of their buds when we started getting this really cold weather that I was talking about. And luckily for us, we actually also just installed a vineyard weather station system. And so we have 4 monitors, 4 stations, I should say, spread throughout the vineyard, kind of across the vineyard and in those different soil types I was mentioning. And it's both air temperature, rainfall, wind speed, but it's also soil temperature, soil moisture, things like that. That was very perfect timing. One, because April 1st is the official start of the growing season for grapes. So it's when we start tracking heat units, like how much ripening units have fallen on each vine thus far. But it also allowed us to really get good data on this cold snap that we had, where we actually had freezing temperatures in the vineyard, which we had to employ some frost protection measures. So at Troon, we have 2 large wind machines, so giant fans, basically, that kick on when it reaches a certain temperature, like 34 degrees. Those fans come on and start spinning. Places that don't have fans, different places in California, sometimes they'll bring in helicopters to basically do the same thing. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to use those fans to mix the air. Generally, you get an inversion that is formed with warmer air above and that freezing air close to the ground. And so if you can get that motion going, you can actually raise the temperature of the air on the ground just enough to prevent those that frost or freeze damage to the vines. So we have the wind machines that kicked on, and then in one of our blocks, we do have overhead sprinklers. It's a pulse system that's targeted. It doesn't go 360 degrees. It kind of just goes down. This is a vertical shoot positioned trained block. And so it just kind of shoots down in both directions down the row. And as the water falls upon the new buds, it actually starts encasing them with ice, which you would think would be a bad thing, but it actually ends up protecting them from even colder temperatures. As long as the water continues to fall and ice has continued to form on those little buds, it's going to stay at right around 32 degrees, right at the freezing point of water. And so even if the temperatures dip significantly below that, those buds should maintain a warmer temperature, still at freezing, but not maybe enough to truly damage them. So we had to employ some of our sprinklers this year to try to minimize any frost damage. So that was it's still a little too early to tell if that affects yields. So, I mean, the good part about frost damage, not that there's really a good part, is it doesn't affect wine quality in any way. What it does is it affects wine quantity, because those first buds that come out are the buds that have the most potential for the most fruit. There's secondary and tertiary buds that can form if the primary buds are damaged. The secondary buds are generally not very fruitful at all, and the tertiary buds don't have fruit on them. In general, the more of those primary buds you lose, the less fruit you have, but the fruit you do have is in no way compromised. So, it's just, unfortunately, it's less wine we get to make. So, but for us, I believe our systems worked well. We were just on those thresholds anyways. And I think we didn't have much of an issue here with frost in our vineyards. So time will tell, but things look good. And and I mean, interestingly enough, also though, around in April, not only did we have frost, we also had snow. Like I mentioned, we get snow in January and February sometimes, but it actually snowed in April in the Applegate. So that was highly unusual. But again, it's we're hoping that we kind of went through that, and it was a great time to test out our weather stations. So I'm glad we had those in place. And then I guess moving into the winery side, in a similar way that the vineyards are a little dormant in the winter, the winery is a little bit dormant in the winter. It's a pretty calm time, that manic energy of harvest has passed. And now we kind of shift from the active, winemaking more towards monitoring. And what that means for red wines, basically all of the red wines have now fermented, they've been pressed, they're resting in barrels, pretty much, neutral French oak barrels for the most part. And now they're going through what is sometimes called a secondary fermentation, but a malolactic fermentation. So all of the sugar has already been converted by the yeast from sugar into alcohol. So that fermentation is done. But now there's a bacterial process that occurs that takes malic acid and converts it into lactic acid. And that process can take several months. It's also spontaneous. We don't, inoculate for it. But that process can take several months, and we want to track that through. Malic acid is something that you may want to keep. You may want to have present in some white wines, maybe like a crisp Sauvignon Blanc or something like that. You might want to maintain that. Malic is a very like green apple, like think Granny Smith type of apple, type of acid. And so that would be something that could be pleasant to have in maybe a crisp white, but generally speaking, you wouldn't want that sort of flavor in a red wine. So we just monitor those barrels through simple paper chromatography on a barrel by barrel basis to see how it's going through that malolactic fermentation. And it can take several months. And basically, once we see the dot disappear, so paper chromatography allows us to separate out the acids in wine. There's mainly tartaric acid and malic acid in the grapes. And then what we can see then is, you see tartaric acid and you see some malic acid in the chromatography. And eventually you start seeing less malic acid, and then you start seeing some lactic acid. And over time, the malic acid will disappear, the lactic acid will get larger. And at that point, we can collect a sample, send it to an analytical lab to give us a precise number to let us know that, yes, all of the malic acid is non-detectable. This process has completed. And at that point, the wine basically goes into just an aging phase. There's the changes that are happening to that wine is done. And we're now just going to be aging it for various amounts of time in those neutral oak barrels before we bottle it. So most of our red wines then are now, we basically have 2 barrels left in our cellar that have not completed that malolactic fermentation, but we've kind of shifted over for the rest of our 2021 red wines to that kind of aging phase. And we'll just be waiting for those 2 stragglers to catch up. And then the cellar will be basically harvest will truly be over. The wines will then be into aging. For white wines, though, harvest is not over, only because the fermentation of our white wines is still ongoing. It often takes up to 6 months for our white wines in barrel to finish fermentation. So they go into barrel, generally late September, mid-October timeframe. And they ferment strongly initially. And again, these are spontaneous fermentations. We do not add any yeast or sugar or acid additions. It's all just grape juice in the case of white wine. We press the grapes to barrel, and they ferment in barrel. As the wintertime approaches, the cellar gets cooler, temperatures go down. It's kind of like sticking something in your refrigerator, like biological activity really slows down, and those ferments, those white ferments also slow down. So we continue to monitor the sugar levels, and we just watch them just tick down. And that's still happening with some of our white wines. Several of them have totally gone dry. That meaning when I say dry, I mean all of the sugar initially in the grapes have been converted by yeast into alcohol. So there's no sugar left in them. All of Troon wines ultimately are dry wines. Even wines that can have fruitier textures, aromas, they may come across as sweet sometimes, but it's not sugar. It's your brain telling you, oh, peaches are sweet, and I taste peaches, this must be sweet. But in terms of winemaking, eventually all of the sugar is consumed by the yeast and converted to alcohol. So that's the process that we are waiting to finish for some of those white wines. In a similar way to the red wines, often the white wines will undergo that malolactic fermentation simultaneously with the end of that the alcoholic fermentation. So we do monitor for that as well, just like the red wines, and kind of watch how the malic acid is dropping, lactic acid is increasing. And I mentioned before, sometimes you might want to keep the malic acid. We are very lucky at Troon in that our site here, the Applegate Valley, is blessed with these huge diurnal temperature swings between daytime and nighttime in the summertime. So our grapes, our white grapes, maintain really great natural acidity. So for us, it's actually beneficial to go through that malolactic fermentation, even for our white wines, because we still, even though lactic is a little less acidic than malic, we still maintain great acidity, while simultaneously that malolactic fermentation adds a really nice richness and roundness to the palate of the wines. So it's great that our white wines do go through, just spontaneously go through malolactic fermentation in the barrel before bottling. It also makes the wine more stable as well. And we like using just very minimal levels of sulfur here. And so the more stable the wine is when I bottle it, the less amount of sulfur we add, which is still quite low. Our wines qualify for raw wine, very, very low input wines indeed. So that was going on then in the first several months of the cellar. And then we also just finished up our very first spring bottling of the year. So that's normally a March event. This year was an April event because of supply chain issues. Glass is having the same difficulties, wine bottles, same difficulties as many other products these days. And we were not able to get all the glass we needed until a little bit later. So we bottled in April. We were able to bottle our Kublai Bench Rosé, our Kublai Bench Amber, and our Glue Glue Grenache. So all of those wines are now in bottle and will be releasing quite shortly. So that's that in and of itself is a fun process. The wines had been in barrel, and so to prepare for the bottling, we rack the wines from barrel to tank. And what that basically means, the word rack really means, is you've got a barrel of wine, and most of that is wine, and at the bottom there's the lees, which is the dead yeast cells kind of left over from fermentation. They settle down to the bottom. They do a lot of good things. They actually break down, add some interesting proteins, manoproteins, and sapid proteins, things that also add a richness and almost a sweetness to the mouthfeel, although they're not sugar, it's protein. But anyway, so when we rack it, we basically take the wine into tank and we leave the lees behind. And for us, which we do not fine or filter any of our wines, so it's important that we try to make that as clean of a process as possible to get just the wine off, leave the lees, so we don't end up with a lot of sediment in our resulting bottles. So the wine is racked to tank, and then we actually have a mobile bottling truck show up for the day. So that just can drive up and park here. We just attach a hose from our tank to the truck, and that truck is capable of bottling about 2,000 cases in a day. So that's 24,000 bottles of wine that we can bottle in one day, which is roughly what we just did for our spring bottling. So that kind of takes us, from January to now. And now in the winery, our attention immediately turns to, okay, we've got one bottling done. Now let's start thinking about our June bottling, where we bottle the Syrahs and some of the red wines from the previous vintage. So now we're looking at our 2020 Syrah, Grenache, wines, as well as some of the 2021 white wines that I mentioned are just now finishing up their fermentation. So that takes us up to the present time with the winery.
Nate, I've got a quick question for you. For the folks who've been following along, they may know that we've been in the process of replanting all 50 acres of grapes here. And we're at the end of this spring, we'll be about 80% finished with that replant. And today literally today, our team is out in the field replanting about a 5-acre block. What are some of those new varietals? What are you going to be working with in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so this year, thanks for that question. Yeah, for this year, we are going to be getting Morved, Carignan, Cinsault, Counois, and Grenache, more Grenache. So that's kind of like a first for us. Some of those varieties, Carignan in particular, and just the second year we've received some of them. And then what they're planting right now is they're planting more Tannat, more Grenache, more Syrah, some Roussanne, yeah, I think that's I probably messed one, but so that 5 acres then will be being planted now. The developing a vineyard is a very slow motion process, so it'll be 3 years before we start getting any fruit off of those vines. 4 to 5 years until we truly start getting those vines into production. So it's exciting to see them go into the ground, and then we wait for several years before we start getting to bring that into the winery. Yeah.
Well, that's what's going on down on the farm. But we are very lucky to have a group of wonderful distributors we work with throughout the country. So I'm going to move to our own road warrior and certified sommelier, national sales manager, Nate Winters, to tell us about his travels.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep this somewhat brief. I only have a couple of these talking points, and I don't know how much I can flesh out on some of them, but yeah, we can start with the traveling. As we've been going through this certification process, revitalizing the farm, the people at the farm, the wine quality increasing, that's all led to more awareness, more people with the spotlight on us, and more interest in what we're doing, along with the new packaging. So we've adjusted some packaging refinements on these bottles. Of course, we don't use the capsules on top of the wine. We have a specific cork, the Diem Origine, so it's lined with more vegetable oils and beeswax. The bottles that we chose are the lightest that we could find to make the most sense. And then, of course, our labels are not made from trees, they're made from sugarcane. So trying from the farm all the way to the packaging to have as much intentions lining our products that we can. And so with that being said, all of this accumulating to the distributors. And I think over the past 3 years, we've accumulated about 17 distributors. So we've had a really large jump. We're in about 18 states, and we just broke into Canada. Quebec and Alberta has Troon wines in the country. So our reach has definitely expanded, and not necessarily fully surprising, but very much anticipating what's to come still. We're very optimistic about where we've come from and where we're still going. And I think everybody's seeing that as well. So increase in states means increase of travel. Last year is where I'll begin this little recap about November. We do a lot of these events that are very inclusive as far as minimal intervention goes for winemaking. As our winemaker Nate said, the Raw Wine Festival, that was a festival that took place in New York, which is a focus on like raw wine. And I know that can be a vague term, but very minimal intervention, very low sulfur levels, not manipulated, as basic as you can get to what the wine is making itself into, rather than us intervening. So that's a fun one to be a part of. Producers from Italy and from France and from America. It's kind of a big melting pot of us all to get together and kind of see what we're all up to. And then, of course, it's open to consumers and to restaurants and retail grocery store buyers to come in and try our wines and see firsthand what we're about and talk to us, and then make a decision if they want to support us or not. So Raw Wine took place in New York, LA. They'll go back to New York in the fall, and we will be there again of this year. We had the Wild World event, which was in Brooklyn. And the Wild World is an event not necessarily focused on wine, but focused on wild fermentations. whether it be beer or cider or fermented tea or wine. All of these products are definitely welcome. And again, the common theme is wild or native fermentations. So it's a perfect group for us to be in, but like-minded individuals such as consumers or people in the industry like to go to these events as well. We've gotten a lot of great feedback. Of course, we don't filter our wine. We don't intervene in the cellar. We don't add water or acid or anything. So it's always great talking points and to find other people with like-minded philosophies to be around. And then the last event, which was the Slow Wine event. Slow Wine started over in Europe, but it's just recently been coming over to the States for the past couple of years. And there's a lot of guides out there. There's the Michelin guide, for example. The Slow Wine guide, it actually focuses more on like building a relationship with its producers on who is in its guide. So of course, they're looking for integrity-driven operations, producing wine that's being considerate of the land and the agriculture of the product and the people. So we've gotten the Snail Award and the Slow Wine Award. These are awards that recognize us for being environmentally friendly, also cost to quality, or I said quality to cost ratio, giving you the most bang for your buck for our wines. So these are great events that happen periodically throughout the year. They're not always back to back. So from November until now, we've done 3 or 4 of these events. And again, it's just been really nice to have that word out there. In October, we had Eric Asimov release an article for us in the New York Times. And so that Wild World event coincided perfectly to when the article came out. So we're seeing a lot more press about Troon. We're participating a lot more, not just on the grand scale, but locally for our local communities and local restaurants or local farms that are around us. To have these collaborations and partnerships with them is important to us, of keeping, the local aspect with the business. There's a couple of restaurants that we're collaborating with that we are growing specific things like peppers or tomatoes for this restaurant here, and this restaurant wants to use our honey. So I think it's important for us to recognize and to give back and participate in the community instead of just having closed doors and secrets. And that's always been fun too, to make new friendships. With the increasing of the states, like I said, there's about 18 of our distributors, and we cover the entire state of each one of those states. For example, in Michigan, the northern part, all the way in Traverse City, all the way down to Detroit. So not just focusing on the hubs in these big cities, but really trying to get the wine as far of a reach that we can, but keeping in mind that we only make, as of right now, about 4,000 cases of wine. So every year, as our vines start coming online and giving us more fruit, you'll see our production go up, maybe to around 10,000 cases or so. So we can still keep that intimacy in all of our products. So finding good relationships with retail and wine shops and good restaurants that we have good relationships with is really the goal for us. So wherever you do find Troon, there should be a very educated staff and a good support from both sides, where you may find it. And some of those, you
made some exciting placements in New York. Why don't you go over some of those?
Yeah, exactly. You cut me off. The words right out of my mouth. It was perfect. So the retail support in New York is a place like Astor Wines or Gramercy Cellars. Some of these kind of staple wine shops and independent retailers in the city where everyone goes for their wine. As you know, in Manhattan, there's not too many, like if you have a brick and mortar setup, you don't have the biggest setup most times. So the Astor Fine Wines is a great shot to have it. Gramercy Cellars. There's a lot of independent retail shops in Brooklyn these days as well, that slip in my head, off the top of my head. But more recognizable chains would be Whole Foods, New Seasons, and Market of Choice, Zupan markets here in Oregon, kind of these more health conscious and aware retailers that are focusing on the people and the products having integrity, which I think we have both of those checked off. We just picked up distribution in Texas and California, so we'll be launching with them in June, and you'll slowly start to see these wines populate these bigger markets, the PCC markets, the central markets. So our wines will become more accessible as we partner with these distributors, and of course, we appreciate your patience now, but these wines will be able to get soon. As far as restaurants go, here in Oregon, there's wonderful restaurants. Moss here in Southern Oregon, which is it's kind of like a 10-course dinner experience of Pacific Northwest local cuisine, and our wine is featured on this pairing option, so you can have sake and wine as you go through this course. And our wines, as we've spoke about before, being lower alcohol and higher acid, they're very versatile to pair with food rather than being really rich and jammy and heavy that kind of overwhelm your dish. Our wines tend to go with a lot of different foods, even with spice. So Moss, a brand new restaurant that's opening this in the summer, Okta, the Allison Inn, you have Canard, Departure, of course, Canard, there'll be a second location, but associated with Le Pigeon, who's carried our wines. So you're seeing these really priority, top-notch restaurants carrying our wine. Here on the West Coast, you can find some in Michigan, Denver, but the main stars just recently, and this is a recap of Q1, just before the new year, we did acquire 3 placements that have Michelin star ratings. So 2 one-star Michelin restaurants being I Fiori and then Crown Shy, both in Manhattan, wonderful supporters. We have wines that we have Tannat and Vermentino, which aren't necessarily mainstream grapes that everybody knows, but when you get into some of these restaurants that have a very sophisticated program for wine, they really gravitate towards these kind of hand-curated wines that they can pair with their food instead of just a Cabernet all the time. So I see a lot more traction for our kind of single varietal, creative and unique wines in some of these places in the city. Whereas you go to more of a rural approach, you have a little bit more relaxed environment. And then of course, the 2-star Michelin is Oscar, located in Brooklyn, which is a Scandinavian restaurant that carries our Tannat and our Vermentino. So I think all of this is kind of the proof in the pudding, as I said before, of over about 3 years, acquiring a large number of distributors with interest, but then seeing the impact that it's all being made, not just hearing it from us, because we love what we do, but then hearing everybody else talk about it, I think is the reassurance that we're on the right path. And of course, making my job as a sales guy a lot easier to get the wine on your table and spread the word of everything. The last thing that I mainly wanted to talk about was new releases. As we mentioned, we just had a bottling in the springtime. And so this new release is important timing to get all these brand new wines out to the market as fast as we can, because everybody's waiting on them. We do have these lots like our rosé and our amber wines and some other wines that are small quantity lots and they tend to run out quickly. So I think this demand has been pent up for our Vermentino, for say, that we've been sold out of for months, that we will have released in the summertime. So for me, it's just about the calm before the storm. We got these wines bottled, they have brand new packaging on them. We're getting the distributors picking them up. Once the distributors pick these wines, I will then go and visit each market. So I'll go to California, I'll go to Texas, and I'll spend a couple days there working with the distributor team, helping them be able to tell our story better, and going to these accounts and making sure we can answer all the questions and provide the info. So when you go into a wine shop, then that shop can actually answer all of your questions. Or if not, they can reach out to us directly and we can answer your questions as well. So ended last year on a good note with all these events. Now the timing is just getting ready to hit the road with some travel and some new wines. So look forward to seeing Troon in some markets near you. If you have any questions on where to find Troon, you can always go to our website, shameless plug of troonvineyard.com. On all social media is at Troon Wines. You can always reach out to us or send us a message or call the tasting room and we'll answer any questions you have. But that's kind of all I have for right now.
Nate, you have an event coming up in Austin, right?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we are doing the Wild World events. And so it's kind of like a tour, and this will be Wild World in Austin, just outside of Austin in Texas Hill Country. And so again, very like-minded other California and Oregon wineries that are producing. It's nice that there's not a ton of Oregon wineries producing in these things. In Oregon, I'm sure Nate and Craig know the exact number, but what is there, about 11 or 12 biodynamic vineyards in the state of Oregon? So it kind of puts us in a small pool of associates anyways. So when we go here, maybe the only Oregon winery that's participating, which gives us, you know, a nice upper hand and something new to talk about to all these people.
And
So
in February, I was in Paso Robles for the Roan Rangers event, followed by Third Coast SWAF in Chicago in March, which is very much like the Raw Wine Fair. And I just got back from Husby Sterone, which is a fabulous event, and you know, it's just really exciting for us to get our wines out there. So as everybody can see, we've had a pretty busy first quarter. We'll be doing this every quarter, giving you the rundown of what we've been of our work, and we look forward to sharing the news with you and our wines. Thank you.